Coming up on today's episode of Airborne Unlimited, the issuance of student pilot certificates is in for a big change. The last S-3 Viking leaves U.S. Navy service. The NTSB releases its 10 most wanted list. I'm Bree Cross. It's January 15th, 2016, and this is Airborne Unlimited. The FAA has published an update to its student pilot application process in the Federal Register that includes a major change in how the certificates are issued. All pilots in training for any certificate level always start as student pilots. The student pilot certificate is required for students in training to fly solo when authorized to do so through instructor endorsement. Up until this proposed change, the paper student pilot certificate has been issued automatically by medical examiners or through a 15-minute process with an improved FAA representative. The proposed change requires applicants to apply for a student pilot certificate through a Flight Standards District Office, designated pilot examiner, airman certification representative associated with a pilot school, or certified flight instructor. Aviation medical examiners will no longer issue a combination medical certificate and student pilot certificate. The certificate will be plastic rather than paper, which means that it cannot be issued on the spot. This could lead to a significant delay in a student pilot being able to exercise solo privileges. The preamble of the proposed change cites the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act that requires vetting of the student pilots prior to issuance of a certificate as the reason for the change. After more than 40 years of service, on Monday of this last week, the last S-3B Viking in the U.S. Navy service launched one last time from the runway at Naval Base Ventura County, Point Mugu, California. Originally introduced in 1974 by Lockheed as a replacement for the S-2 tracker, the Viking has ranged far from its anti-submarine warfare roots to perform various roles such as organic tanking, electronic intelligence, and carrier onboard delivery. The Viking officially retired from Navy service in 2009, but like many military members, the 3SB was called upon to continue to serve the fleet in another capacity. The last Viking will give at least one more round of federal service before it retires, as the final launch from Point Mugu was headed for NASA, not the Boneyard. But for Viking pilots and enthusiasts, the final Navy flight is bittersweet. After the break, the NTSB expresses concern over loss of control accidents and distracted pilots.
Redbird is quickly becoming the industry standard for flight training. Since Redbird introduced its revolutionary FMX in 2007, colleges, universities, and flight training operations around the world have integrated Redbird products into their curriculum. It's time to discover what Redbird can do for you. Join the migration.
There's a difference between charting a steady course and pushing for the ceiling. And for nearly a century, Hartzell Propeller has been defining that difference. It's in our passion for engineering and research and our dedication to testing the limits of performance. We are built on honor. We are Hartzell Propeller.
Welcome back. If you would like to be a supporter of Airborne Unlimited, send an email to jim@aero-news.net. The NTSB released its 10 most wanted list, which highlights safety issues identified from the NTSB's accident investigations, and several aviation-related items were on the list. The NTSB said that while airline accidents have become relatively rare in the United States, pilots and passengers involved in general aviation operations still die at alarming rates. Between 2008 and 2014, about 47% of fatal fixed-wing GA accidents in the United States involved pilots losing control of their aircraft in flight. The board also mentioned accidents in which fatigue was a factor in all areas of transportation, including aviation, as a focus area, as well as distractions in the cockpit from things like text messaging and other personal electronic devices that have been a contributing factor in some accidents. The NTSB said that the FAA, aviation advocacy groups, type clubs, and manufacturers, including kit manufacturers, are creating and maintaining educational incentives that include general principles, best practices, and operational specifics as they relate to loss of control. They say these resources can be helpful in learning effectiveness countermeasures. It's Friday, and that means that it's time for ANN CEO and Editor-in-Chief Jim Campbell to check in with his weekly Barnstorming commentary. As Jim looks ahead into 2016, he says that the FAA can do better, but as he looks at the aviation side of the equation, he says that we must do better. Here's this week's Barnstorming.
Thanks, Bree, and hi, folks. Sorry to have missed you guys last week, but I had an interesting couple of trips. First was to the Consumer Electronics Show, which was innovation heaven. We saw things there that were not only profound and interesting, but beyond the UAV area, which was very active, very innovative, and very exciting, there was a tremendous amount of technology there that had relationships to some of the things that we use in aviation or could be using in aviation in the future, and it boggles the mind what could happen if we could harness that kind of creativity and transfer it to aviation. A couple days later, though, I was in Ontario, California at the AMA Expo, where once again the innovation that has been brought to the model aviation game is really quite extraordinary. A couple things have occurred. The electric RC models have become all the rage. They're very simple. They're very inexpensive. The entry level, when I was a kid, when I was 12 years old, it cost me $1,000 to field an RC helicopter and about $600 to field a good RC airplane back in the day. For $100, you can afford to field a really extraordinary model, in some cases scale models with phenomenal detail, tremendous controllability, stability augmentation systems, computer radios, so forth and so on. Really quite extraordinary. And it led me to think very simply this: if we could harness that kind of creativity and bring it into full-scale aviation, what could possibly happen? But then again, for the rest of the show, one of the problems that was evident to everybody was the looming overlord type behavior from the FAA. All of a sudden, models that had a 100-year history of statistical insignificance in regards to their involvement in the national airspace system were being heavily regulated, i.e. registrations and so forth, and more to come from what we understand, were being regulated by the FAA. Fees were being charged, even though they'll initially be refunded, although some of the initial refunds have so far failed to show up. A lot of information's being requested. Privacy may be going out the window. And the one thing I don't think the model aviation world really understands yet and has to be seriously concerned about is enforcement actions by the FAA go by administrative procedures. And while the Pilot's Bill of Rights, one, has ameliorated it somewhat, one, will that apply to model aviators? And two, if PBOR2 comes across the way, that'll help a little bit more. But the plain fact of the matter is that the average drug pusher on a street corner has more rights to justice than a model aviator, a full-scale aviator, or anybody else. In other words, some of the most innovative aspects of aviation are about to come under and are under the thumb of the FAA, but in bigger ways for the future. It's terrifying because model aviation has represented the entry level of aviation for so many. Many of today's full-scale aviators, private, commercial, military, started with a model airplane in the basement, like yours truly, at 12 years old. What's going to happen when the FAA keeps pushing the limits in how they want to control not just model aviation, but the rest of aviation? And will they strangle an industry that is struggling to recover from years of malaise and now needing innovation for the future? Will that innovation be allowed to take place because the FAA has decided to become the overlord of all that flies? For the Aero-News Network, Airborne, and Aero-TV, we'll be revisiting this more in the future. And oh yeah, next week, Major Bob Hoover documentary update. Thank you.
After these messages, the FAA administrator to speak at the AEA convention.
Concorde's recombinant gas RG series sealed battery technology produces a high-performance battery with the advantages of being pre-tested and fully charged at the factory. Find out more about Concorde's entire line of batteries at www.concordebattery.com. Concorde, the heart of your aircraft.
Sandia introduces the new SAI 340 Quattro TSO'd airspeed, attitude, altitude, and slip. With integral backup battery, safety never looked so good. See it now at www.sandia.aero.
Welcome back. With so much news coming out of the aviation industry, we're summarizing some other interesting stories in a brief segment we call Around the Patch. The Aircraft Electronics Association International Convention and Trade Show, being held in Orlando, Florida in April, is a major event. It has been announced that on the opening day, April 28th, FAA Administrator Michael Huerta will open the morning regulatory session. Piper Aircraft has received an amendment to the validation of its type certificate issued by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. The amendment allows for the addition of Garmin G1000 avionics in the Piper Archer TX LX training aircraft. The first 4 A-29 Super Tucano airplanes are set to be delivered to Afghanistan later this month. The planes are among 20 that were ordered under a contract award in 2013. Afghan pilots who are being trained in the U.S. will deliver the aircraft. The NTSB's preliminary report on the accident of December 29, 2015 in Anchorage, Alaska, mostly recounts what we already know. They report the investigation had been turned over to the FBI and did not address the issue that the crash was a probable suicide. The Living Legends of Aviation Awards, being held on January 22nd, honors the greats in aviation. Among others, this year's honorees include Boeing's Ray Connor and the 2 remaining aviators of the Doolittle raid of World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cole and Staff Sergeant David Thatcher. Well, that's the trip around the patch. Now let's move on to the rest of the news. Transport Canada has lifted the suspension it had placed on Canadian airline Buffalo Airways on November 30th of last year, clearing the way for the carrier to resume operations. The Hay River Hub reports that the suspension was lifted earlier this week. General Manager Bruce Jonasson said that the change means, quote, "we're going back to work." The company will ramp back up, beginning with cargo flights by its signature fleet of DC-3 airplanes. This will likely happen in a few days, according to Jonasson, but getting back to carrying passengers will take a little longer, he said. Jonasson said the company had worked hard to address specific concerns pointed out by Transport Canada and had hired a consultant to help it address those issues. A timeline for resuming passenger flights has not been established. Well, that's our program for today. Remember to get comprehensive real-time 24/7 coverage of the latest aviation and aerospace stories anytime at aero-news.net. Remember that Airborne Unlimited is streamed daily Monday through Friday, with additional breaking news bulletins for important stories that fall outside of our normal deadlines. Please join us and a growing roster of over 100 outstanding industry associations and organizations every weekday for the best in aviation and aerospace news from the staff of the Aero-News Network, the aviation world's most comprehensive news and information resource. Have a wonderful weekend. We will see you Monday.